Then I'm going to talk about sample knitting versus test knitting. So these are two things that I've seen thrown about a lot on social media and in various knitting forums and that kind of thing, and they quite often get confused. And this video is kind of partly inspired by a post I saw on Reddit a few weeks ago, where somebody had agreed to knit a sample. I think it was for a magazine, and they were complaining that the pattern appeared not to have been tech edited yet and was full of errors or possible errors and wasn't very easy to follow. And they were having complaining about that on Reddit, and should I approach a magazine, blah blah blah. And I think a lot of people confuse test knitting and sample knitting. I kind of made a comment, and then I kind of got like, yeah, I know that kind of attitude, so I just left it. I do find that some forums on Reddit are very not very tolerant of other people's opinions. They're a bit kind of, I don't know. I'm not going to say which forum on Reddit or group on Reddit it was on, or link to it here, because I don't want to get shot down in flames. So, but anyway, so I thought I would talk about sample knitting versus test knitting. If you are a normal knitter, you might think, well, why would I care? Well, some people find it interesting. Some of you may have done test knitting or sample knitting. Some of you may be interested in doing test knitting or sample knitting. Some of you might just want to find out a bit more about how the knitting world and design world works. So that's why I thought about it. I do want to say these are my experiences and my views, and other people may have other experiences and other views and do things differently. This is just how what I've experienced, and I've been designing knitting patterns now for 16, 17, 18 maybe years. So quite a long time. So this is just my experience. So my name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns. I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website YarnAddict.co.uk. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. So let's talk about sample knitting first. Many designers use sample knitting to help them produce samples for their patterns, because let's face it, knitting takes a long time. And if you are writing a book, or you're designing a collection for a yarn company, or you designing patterns for magazines, and you have quite regular deadlines, or even if you self-publish stuff, sometimes producing all the samples can be very time consuming. So as well as knitting samples for my patterns, I also have to submit to magazine yarn companies for future design works. So for example, this week I'm working on a design submission for a magazine I design for regularly, but I also have a deadline for that magazine. So I've got to juggle working on new ideas and also getting my work finished on time for the deadline. So it is a lot of juggling, and it's not easy to get it all done. So sample knitters are really, really useful. At the moment I have one sample knitter working on a deadline for me for a couple of weeks' time, because I realized that having two deadlines 2 weeks apart meant it would be difficult for me to actually do both of them myself. And then I'm about to send out yarn for another sample knitter to work on something that's due in about a month's time. And then I have one that's due probably in about 6 weeks' time, which I'm planning to knit myself at this point. So it's just sometimes you've got to look ahead of what deadlines you have coming up, and how much you can do yourself, and then work out what you need sample knitters to do. There are some designers who do most of their knitting themselves. There are some designers who use sample knitters for everything. And I think there are a couple of yarn companies, like some of the bigger yarn companies perhaps, that the designer basically just comes up with the idea and does like a spec, if you like, of the idea, like a detail of their idea, like sketches, swatches, the design details, construction method, things like that. And then basically the yarn company has somebody who writes up the pattern, and then they arrange for the sample to be knitted. That's not the way I work. I've not worked with any yarn companies that work like that, but I know that some do. And I also know that some designers never knit any of their samples themselves. They just use sample knitters. But I do a lot of sample knitting myself. That's why I got into designing, because I like knitting. So I try and do as many samples myself as I can. But obviously I can't do everything. And especially when I wrote my book, Speedy Lace Knitting and Easy Lace Knits, I had to use sample knitters. For beaded lace knitting, I think I knitted maybe 1 or 2 of the samples, and the rest were done by sample knitters. I had quite a big team of sample knitters at that point. At the moment, I've got 2 regular ones and 1 who's doing a little bit for me. She's a new sample knitter. She's brilliant, so I'm hoping I can give her more regular work in the future as well. Most sample knitters work directly for the designer, but some magazines and yarn companies will use sample knitters as well. So some magazines will offer designers, if you can't knit the sample, they will offer to arrange the sample knitting for you, but then obviously they pay you less because they have to pay the sample knitter. As a sample knitter, you get sent a yarn and the pattern. You agree a deadline with the designer or the yarn company or the magazine. The pattern is likely to be in draft form. So other people may work differently to me. So I will write the pattern in the size that the sample is in. So if the sample is a size 10, I will write the pattern in a size 10 and send that off to my sample knitter. They will knit it, then it'll come back to me. I will do all the finishing, and then I will measure the tension and make any adjustments if I need to, because sometimes the final tension is not always the tension that I was working to when I wrote the draft pattern. Then I will add all the other sizes. I used to sometimes add all the sizes and do it all in one go, and then I found that if I had to change the tension or things were not quite right, there was a few changes I had to make, I had to then change all the sizes. So now I find it easier to write it in the sample size, get that knitted up, and then add all the other sizes later. That seems to take me less time. So that's how I work. But I have in the past sent patterns off to sample knitters where I've just written the pattern for the back and sent that off because I haven't had time to finish it, and then they'll text me and say, I've nearly finished the back now, where's the rest of the pattern? And then I'll write it for the front, and then they might eventually get the sleeves. So sometimes they may not even have the full pattern. What they won't have is they won't have a photograph. So when you buy a pattern, there will be a photograph of the sample. They won't have that at all. Some designers might include their sketch. I don't, because my sketches are not that great and I don't think they're that useful. I do sometimes include a photo of the stitch pattern. I used to do that. I haven't done it so much lately, but I probably should start doing that again. Include a photo of the stitch pattern so they can just tell that they're on the right track from that point of view. I expect my sample knitters to ask if anything is unclear, or if they're not sure about something, or if something doesn't look right, or if there's a mistake or things like that. I expect them to ask me if there's something they're not quite sure about, and they're pretty good at doing that. Some designers may require their sample knitters to do all the finishing, like sewing up, blocking, all that kind of stuff. I prefer to do that myself, but if a deadline clashes with, for example, when I'm away on holiday and things like that, then I have sometimes asked my sample knitter if they can do all the finishing and block it and send it straight to the magazine, but then I normally pay them a little bit extra. So sample knitters are usually paid. Some yarn companies and indie dyers may pay their sample knitters in yarn, so they may say, a lot of indie dyers and yarn companies may want extra samples knitted up. A lot of indie dyers, for example, like to have samples knitted up of popular patterns so they can display it as shows and things and show people what to knit with their yarns, and they will quite often get sample knitters to do some of that knitting, and they will then quite often pay them in yarn, which is fair. Pay is fairly low for sample knitting, and I do see this getting criticised a lot on social media, that knitting for sample knitting or pay for sample knitting is so low. What I will say is that magazines don't pay a lot to designers, and yeah, it's just not a very well paid job. I do see pay rates for sample knitters being criticised a lot on social media, and yes, I wish I could pay my sample knitters minimum wage for their sample knitting, but that's not going to happen because sample knitting just takes too long. So I do understand the criticism for the pay. I also think if you know what the pay is before you take on the job, it's up to you whether you want to say yes or not. If you think, no, my time's worth more than that, fine, absolutely. I agree. But then just don't do it. I mean, it's your choice. If I say to somebody, I mean, I've kind of advertised, if you like, or I used to like ask my blog, I'm looking for more sample knitters. If you're interested, get in touch. By the way, I'm not looking for any more sample knitters at the moment. But when I do, last time I did, I had loads of people get in touch. I emailed out the expectations and what the pay rates were, and some said yes please and some said no, and that's fine. Somebody said no, sorry, that's just not enough money, and I'm like, okay, fine, fair enough, I don't disagree with that, but I'm paying you as much as I can afford to pay you based on what I'm getting paid. Some designers pay per meter of yarn used, and some pay a set fee depending on difficulty, yarn thickness, urgency of deadline, things like that, what type of garment or accessory it is. Yes, I wish I could pay more, but designers aren't paid that much either. I was talking to somebody who worked for a magazine a few years, well, quite a few years ago now, and she said that magazine staff aren't being paid that much either. So I think basically in the knitting and crafting world, nobody's making a lot of money, and that's why most designers do other things. They have they sell yarn, they do teaching and things like that. Most people have, or they write books as well as some for magazines. Most designers have several income streams because designing alone really doesn't pay that much money. So that is sample knitting in a nutshell. So let's talk about test knitting. With test knitting, the pattern has been written and should have been tech edited, and a sample has already been knitted, and it should be more or less ready to be published. And some designers use test knitters instead of tech editors, which I think is a bad idea. I did when I started designing. When I started designing, I didn't know how things work, basically. I didn't know that you were supposed to have a tech editor or a pattern checker check your pattern. So I used a sample, I used a test knitter to check if my pattern worked, if my pattern was correct. But then I realised you're supposed to have a tech editor, and I found myself a tech editor, and since then I've used tech editors. And I've done less test knitting because I don't think it's that reliable, but I'll come back to that. These days it's a lot easier to find tech editors. When I started designing, there wasn't that many resources for freelance designers. There wasn't Ravelry. Now you've got groups on Ravelry kind of aimed at tech editors and designers. And you have things like social media, Instagram. There's an account called, I think it's called the Tech Editor Hub. But it's easier now to find things because of Ravelry and social media. Those resources weren't there when I started designing. We had blogs, that was it. So I didn't have those resources when I started designing. The designer writes the pattern, knits the sample, has the pattern tech edited, and then it gets sent out to test knitters. The reason why designers use test knitters vary a lot. Some use test knitters because they want to make sure the pattern works in each size, for example, and there are no errors that have slipped through the net, because despite how many times my tech editor and I go through the pattern, sometimes errors will slip through. Even if you use 10 test knitters on a pattern, errors will still slip through. I would argue that making sure the pattern is error-free is probably best achieved by using a tech editor than a test knitter, in my experience. Most designers, if they're honest, most designers that use test knitters, if they're really honest with themselves, use test knitters because they want more photos of their pattern for when they release it. So they want the pattern shown in different yarns, different colors, on different sizes, and a lot of designers will screen their test knitters for their social media profiles. So they expect to see a social media profile, and they expect you to take good photographs. I've heard designers who only let people with a lot of followers test knit for them. So you've got to have a certain number of minimum followers, and you've got your photographs have to be a certain standard and a certain aesthetic that fits in with the designer. I would like, when I've done test knitting, I tend to ask for social media profile or examples of their work, just to check that they have the skills to knit what I expect them to knit. I haven't used test knitters a lot because when I have, it's not been a very good experience. I find that errors aren't spotted, and some people don't finish, and it just hasn't been a very good experience. But I do have a pattern at the moment that I am thinking about getting test knitted, because I would like some more photos of it for publication, but also because I've knitted in my size, I would also like it shown on different body types and sizes. But I will talk more about that when the pattern is ready for tech editing. I haven't even written the pattern yet, so it's not ready for a while. And some designers want their sample to be shown in different sizes and body types and different yarns, although some designers will require their test knitters to use specific yarn. Normally as a test knitter you have to pay for your own yarn. So you get the pattern sent to you, but you have to pay for your own yarn. And you don't normally get paid. You may get a free pattern from the designer's other patterns as a thank you. I was actually thinking about, because I don't think I can really afford to pay for a test knitter, but I was thinking about maybe giving them access to one of my online courses or something. So it's something a little bit worth a little bit more than a pattern, but not means I'm not going to be out of pocket too much, because you never know how much money you're going to make when you release a pattern. Sometimes you barely cover your expenses. Just looking outside, it's just started raining and I'm about to walk the dog in a minute. So if you want to do a test knitting, make sure you know what the requirements are beforehand. Will you get paid? Can you use your own choice of yarn? Can you make alterations? Can you use the colour you want? What's the deadline? Will you have time to knit the sample? If it's a sweater and you're a larger size, will you have time to knit the sample in your size in the deadline? I hear that criticised a lot by people who are larger, saying that the deadline just isn't long enough for them to be able to do it. What happens if you can't meet the deadline? What's the process for communicating with the designer about any errors you found or any questions you have about the pattern? And what do you expect to do in terms of sharing your test knit on social media when the pattern is published? Are you expected to share it a certain number of times? What are the requirements for that? Make sure that all the expectations are clear and you know exactly what's expected of you, and especially if you can't finish it on time. Is that still okay? If you finish it a month later, will that still be okay, or will you be blacklisted, for example? So whether you do test knitting or sample knitting, do make sure you know where you're going into. So for both test knits and sample knits, you probably won't be able to share your progress on social media as you knit. So I don't allow my sample knitters to share photos of what they're working on social media. My current sample knitters, one of them I'm not sure that she's on social media actually. One is, but she doesn't share any photos as she's working on stuff that she's knitting for me. Test knitting, some designers might be happy for you to share progress as you're knitting, some may not be. Test knitting and sample knitting are not normally done because you're hoping to make a lot of money, because you won't. It's not going to be a replacement for a job. Most people who sample and test knit do so because they love knitting and they have time to do, they have a lot of time to knit. They may like new challenges. If I was not a designer, I would probably do sample knitting because it would mean I earned a little bit of money from my knitting to pay for yarn and pay for my knitting habit, if you like, my yarn habit. I could also see myself being interested in test knitting because it just gives you a chance to try a pattern from your favorite designer before it comes out, and you feel like you're part of like a little kind of secret club in the inner circle kind of thing. And I think a lot of people like that. But I think most people who sample knit don't do it because they want to make loads of money. They just do it because they enjoy it and it pays them for a little bit of their knitting time. Because if you're going to do sample knitting, you do need a fair bit of time to knit because you don't normally have that many weeks to finish a pattern. So for somebody, one of my sample knitters to knit a garment in size 10, probably about 2 to 3 weeks. I rarely give them more than 3 weeks because I don't get more time allocated than that. So it just depends on what it is and how long the magazine gives me. But you've got to probably expect to be able to knit a size 10 garment in 2 to 3 weeks. So have you test knitted or sample knitted for designers before? Let me know if you have. What was the experience? Did you enjoy it? Would you recommend it or would you not recommend it? Would you do it again? Let me know your thoughts and your experience in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing, and I will see you next time. And now I have to put my coat on and go out and walk the dog in the rain. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.